This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. With the Oscars coming up, former Lyndon Johnson aide Joe Califano unloads on Best Picture nominee Selma for being totally false. Author Jonathan Darman has written a book comparing LBJ with Ronald Reagan, an odd couple who were the last two outsized presidents. And Bill Press talks with Jonathan Allen, co-author of a book about Hillary Clinton. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight, and follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Joe Califano was Lyndon Johnson's top domestic advisor. Today, he blasts the movie Selma for a totally false portrayal of his former boss. And we say hello to Joseph Califano, who was President Lyndon B. Johnson's chief domestic advisor and Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under President Jimmy Carter. He is also the author of a book, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, The White House Years, now reissued with new material. Joseph Califano, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's great to be with you.
And nice to have you with us as well. You have made some very strong statements about a fundamental flaw in the widely heralded movie Selma, which recounts, of course, the days leading up to and following the Bloody Sunday March in Selma 50 years ago. What are some of your complaints exactly?
Well, the portrayal of Lyndon Johnson in that film is false. It's not who Lyndon Johnson was, and it does not indicate what he really did. In the film, he's portrayed as patronizing and contentious with Martin Luther King, and their relationship is contentious, and and indicating that he was reluctant to be pressed on the Voting Rights Act. In fact, President Johnson thought the Voting Rights Act was the greatest piece of legislation of his administration. And God knows there were hundreds of bills passed. And secondly, he had a very close relationship. He and Martin Luther King were canny and committed partners with respect to the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibiting discrimination in employment and in public accommodations, and particularly with respect to the Voting Rights Act. In December of 1964, LBJ and Martin Luther King met at the White House. Andrew Young was there, said it was a respectful meeting of two people trying to figure out what to do. In the movie, that meeting is portrayed as contentious, and Johnson is putting down King. On January 15th, 1965, President Johnson called Dr. King after they discussed appointments for Negroes, that was the term in those years, in high government jobs. Then Johnson said, you'll have billions for education and health care for your people. But the most important thing, Dr. LBJ said, is the vote. If we get them the vote, that'll take 70% of their problems. And at that point, Johnson said, for what I'm going to try and do here, you can make a contribution. That was his word, a real contribution. I want you to find the worst place in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, or South Carolina, where when a Negro goes to register and vote, he's got to recite the Constitution or amendments to it. But where a white person goes to register, he doesn't have to do any of that. Find that place. Get it on radio, get it on television, get it in the pulpits, and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, Johnson said. And then a guy who does nothing but drive a tractor somewhere will say it just isn't fair. King agreed with that and came back on February 9th, a few weeks later, to visit with President Johnson in the White House and said, Selma's the place. Actually, Julian Bond was the person who was working in Selma. And put it together. And Johnson said, fine. He hoped there wouldn't be any violence there. Of course, there was awful violence. John Lewis was banged up in the head. A white minister from Boston was killed. At that point, Lyndon Johnson summoned George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, to the White House. He asked Wallace, "You've got to protect the marches." Wallace said he couldn't do that, made all his typical segregationist remarks, and Johnson said, "Okay, I will do it." Johnson federalized the Alabama National Guard, putting them under the control of the Army, and that group, that guard, protected the marches on the Great March in Selma, from Selma to, and ended up in Montgomery. And incidentally, in the speech Dr. King made in Montgomery when the marchers arrived there, one of the things he did was thank President Johnson for what he was doing. Mm-hmm. And I think the portrayal in the movie of a president who didn't have a close relationship was wrong, which is not true. I think the idea that when there's a scene in which J. Edgar Hoover says to the president, we can take care of this guy permanently or temporarily. Permanently meaning, we can kill him. Mm-hmm. And also the indication that Johnson sent the tapes of King's episode with women in a hotel room to King's wife is not true. Actually, the tapes were being done by order of Robert Kennedy when he was Attorney General, and they were sent to either the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or Mrs. King in 1963 when Johnson was vice president. Now, why do I feel so strongly about this? Aside from the fact that it wasn't true, this is a wonderful, dramatic story of America. A white Southern president partners with a black civil rights leader to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965, something neither of them could have done alone. And that's an important story, especially for today in America, with the tensions we have in New York City and the tensions we have involving Ferguson and I guess with other police forces around the country.
Certainly. Well, let me ask you this, because you mentioned John Lewis, a central figure at Selma. Now, he's expressed that, overall it's a terrific movie and that the filmmaker was merely using artistic license to create a little drama. How do you respond to that? Well,
it's not artistic license. I understand artistic license. I'm a realistic person. But it's not artistic license when you make something that's totally false and put it out there. It's simply not so. And incidentally, John Lewis is also the person who has told me and others publicly that when LBJ gave the speech, he talked to the joint session of Congress and said, "We shall overcome." Martin Luther King cried. John Lewis was with King. Martin Luther King cried. These guys were really were partners. And I think the movie diminishes Dr. King by doing it this way, because Dr. King was also, we look upon him, well, he's a preacher. Sure, he was a great preacher. We know that, a wonderful, wonderful preacher and man of God. But he was also very canny and very committed. He was a good politician. They understood each other, and we on many occasions, we worked with Dr. King when we had the riots in Watts in 1965, when we had the riots in Detroit in 1967. The president said to me, "Joe, call up King, call up Whitney Young, call up Roy Wilkins, get them to go and help us bring things under control, or get their people to get out there and help us bring things under control." And they did.
Now, the movie does obviously portrays conflict between Dr. King and President Johnson. There had to be. Wasn't there some conflict there, though? Is it partially right at all?
No, it's not even partially right in that regard. There was in late '67. I think it was the fall of '67. I'm not sure exactly when, but when Dr. King gave the speech at Harvard coming out opposed to the Vietnam War, it may have been early '68, I can't remember. opposing the Vietnam War, sure, there was some tension over that. But I never saw any tension in the area of civil rights. And think about the kind of a civil rights leader he was and what it meant to have that kind of a relationship. I mean, can you imagine with respect to some of the so-called civil rights leaders we have in the country today, for example, like Sharpton, that calling them up and asking them to go to Ferguson or in New York or somewhere and calm the crowd, a disruptive crowd or even a mob. The quality of civil rights leaders was fantastic in those years.
Better than today.
Certainly different than today, and certainly different than today. And I think it was, when King, and even in the end, just I think about when Dr. King was assassinated. That night, the president said to me, call the civil rights leaders, get them here the next morning. It was about 8 o'clock at night in the White House, and call Dr. King's father. And so I called Dr. King's father, and I said, the president would like you to come up if you're up to it, and we'll have a plane come and fly you up. And he said he wasn't up to it. And I said, well, the president told me to tell you that he prays for God to bless you in this very difficult time. And Dr. King's father said to me, tell the president I want God to bless him. He needs God's blessing more than anybody else in this country right now. Mm. That was the kind of relationship we had. And then we met that next morning with the civil rights leaders. And when they left, the president said to me, we're going to get something out of this awful tragedy. We're going to get our fair housing bill. We'd proposed fair housing over 2 years before. It received more vitriolic mail than anything we had proposed in those years. We had gotten the bill out of the Senate, and we couldn't do anything in the House because the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Emanuel Seller, was from Crown Heights in Brooklyn. He had a district, largely Jewish district, some Italian Americans too, with blacks moving in Crown Heights, and he wasn't about to let that bill out of his committee. And the president said, we've got to get the bill to the floor directly. He wrote to the speaker. He wrote to Jerry Ford, the minority leader. We got the bill to the floor of the House a few days later, passed it. Johnson signed it. So even in the sense, as tragic as that was, even at that moment, there was this relationship between LBJ and Martin Luther King that produced a phenomenal, one of the three major civil rights bills of the Johnson years.
We're speaking with Joseph Califano, who is President Lyndon Johnson's chief domestic advisor, Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under Jimmy Carter, and, of course, the author of the book, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, The White House Years, which has been reissued with new material. Obviously, Mr. Califano, you've got very strong feelings about the movie, and as somebody who was living and breathing all of that was going on at that time, is that part of a larger feeling that perhaps LBJ doesn't get enough credit for all of the things that he did during his presidency?
No, that has nothing to do with the movie. I think Johnson is being, his presidency would always be clouded by the Vietnam War. That's the reality. A terrible mistake. But I think we're now seeing, as we have the 50th anniversary of all this legislation, we're now seeing a reevaluation of that, and he will, over time in history, get credit for, Medicare, Medicaid, aid to elementary and secondary education. 60% of the kids in college are there on a work-study and grant and loan programs in his Higher Education Act. A whole host of other things. That will happen over the next several years because we have one celebration and one recognition after another coming. But that has nothing to do with my view of the movie.
Okay. Joseph Califano, President Lyndon B. Johnson's chief domestic advisor and Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under President Jimmy Carter, author of the book, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, The White House Years, which is now reissued with new material. Mr. Califano, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and good luck with your programming. It's very important.
Thank you very much. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. LBJ was a successful proponent of big government. Ronald Reagan of small government. Yet, author Jonathan Darman says this odd couple amounted to incredibly consequential figures. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Shouldn't America have at least one major party that is not beholden to the corporate elite? Well, look here. Just such a party has popped up, raring to roar into the 2016 presidential race. Called the KB Party, it has the funding and political punch to bypass the establishment's control of the election system. But don't rush to sign up. KB stands for Koch brothers. Yes, Charlie and David, the multi-billionaire right-wing industrial barons who already own several Congress critters, governors, think tanks, AstroTurf campaign machines, front groups, etc., now have their very own private political party. And it's not beholden to the corporate elite, since it is the elite. The Koch boys have rallied roughly 300 like-minded opponents of democracy to their brotherhood of plutocrats, intent on purchasing a president and Congress that will impose their vision of corporate rule over America. At a secretive retreat in January for KB Party funders, the 300 barons ponied up $900 million for their campaign. That's nearly $200 million more than the combined expenditures of the Republican and Democratic parties in last year's elections. And it's way more than either of those parties will have for 2016. This means that in our nation of 350 million people, a cabal of only 300 of the wealthiest will have the wherewithal to narrow the choice of candidates presented to the rest of us, restrict the range of policy ideas that are proposed to voters, imbue the overall campaign with a negative tone, and, most important, shape the governing agenda of those who get elected. This is Jim Hightower saying the Supreme Court's disastrous Citizens United edict created this mess. To help ban the corporate cash that's clogging our elections and killing our people's democratic rights, go to democracyisforpeople.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. What did Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan have in common? Author Jonathan Darman says they were the last consequential presidents because they had a vision of real change. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Jonathan Darman is a journalist, author, writes about American politics and history, and has a book, Landslide, Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan at the Dawn of a New America, which tells the story of 1,000 days in the mid-1960s when two iconic presidents transformed the nation's politics. Jonathan Darman, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you with us. President Johnson said he would not run for re-election because of the pressures of the Vietnam War. Was that the real reason, or was the country simply tired of his Great Society programs?
Johnson in 1968 was under siege from a number of different directions. There was a loss of faith in his leadership of the war, both from people who thought that he should be fighting harder, and from people on the left who felt, that he shouldn't be fighting the war in Vietnam at all. He had lost the faith of his own party, which a lot of people on the left had never really loved him all that much to begin with, and they felt that he was no longer credible. But I do think that there was a broader sort of loss of faith in Johnson's leadership because of the promises that he had made for the Great Society that were so vividly not coming to pass. Early in his presidency, he staked out some great territory, for his vision of government, saying that government that he would lead would set out to solve the most, vexing problems in the history of mankind: hunger, poverty, and disease. And that sounded great. And in the early, in the mid 1960s, that for a moment that was almost believable. But then the reality that starts to emerge on people's television screens is exactly the opposite. It's cities that are falling apart and falling into violence. It's this war in Vietnam, and it's the sense that the country is really facing new and more difficult problems than it had ever faced before. So that gap between what Johnson had promised and the reality that people saw undermines people's faith in his credibility altogether, and really in the whole sort of progressive project of saying that government can and should be involved in trying to improve people's lives.
Do you think Johnson could have done more domestically if he didn't have to pay for the war?
That's certainly what Johnson himself wanted us to believe. At the end of his life, after he left the White House, Johnson knew that Vietnam was going to be this sort of black mark on his presidency. But he wanted to be remembered as a great president for all that he had done domestically. And so he wanted to get Vietnam as far away from his domestic presidency as possible. And so he really creates this narrative of the Great Society was this remarkable accomplishment that really would have achieved all these things that I set out to do for it, but for the war in Vietnam. And Vietnam was this tragic force that he believed, took hold of his presidency and distracted him from doing what was his real passion in his domestic program. Certainly, if Johnson hadn't had the distraction of the Vietnam War, he could have been more attuned to some of the problems that were happening with the implementation of many of his Great Society programs. But I think a more fundamental problem for Johnson was his inability to really connect with the country and to understand a shift in the public's mood, which in the turbulent 1960s was so important. And one of the stories that emerges in the book that I've written is about how a politician like Ronald Reagan is actually much better suited to understand a shifting mood in the country than someone like Lyndon Johnson, who has a much more traditional background in legislative politics.
We're speaking with Jonathan Darman, journalist and author. The book, Landslide, Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan at the Dawn of a New America. Jonathan, do you think that of the competing visions of these two presidents, Reagan's has been the more long-lasting? Is it the more popular?
I think that Reagan's is the one that still exists in a strong sort of unadulterated presence in the Republican Party of today. So if the two visions that I describe are in simplistic form, a Johnsonian vision where government is poised and should solve all problems versus the Reagan vision where government is the problem, the Democrats have understood through some painful elections in the 70s and 80s, that the Johnsonian vision was problematic for them, that they couldn't make grand promises for government to a country that was at times quite anti-government. So what you saw starting with the Clinton presidency was a sort of modification of that Johnsonian vision, whereas in the Republican Party, the Reagan idea of government as the problem has persisted and even grown on the hard right. But I think that the Democrats are still really hampered by the Johnsonian vision because of the interplay between the two stories these men told. Anytime a Democrat wants to get out there and put forward a case for broad government action on a lot of problems, and we certainly have problems that need government in our lives, they have to fight against this lingering perception in the country that they are these naive, big-spending liberals who are going to promise something that they'll never, ever deliver. So really these two men's visions are shaping our politics today, even if some in both parties have moved beyond them.
Now, I'm a progressive, and so this perhaps explains why I can never understand how wave after wave of Republicans announce their hatred of government, then come to Washington to run it. Do you have an explanation for that?
It certainly is confounding, and ultimately it's actually a limitation on the Republican Party. I think it's prevented them from really sort of capitalizing on some of their gains. So what you see is you have certain election years like 1994 or 2010 where the Republicans can run on that anti-government message, and because of the mood of the country in that particular year, find electoral success. But then they can't consolidate it and grow on it because there's no positive governing agenda. And I think people in this country, even if they're suspicious of government, want government that is going to provide them with services that they need in their daily lives. And the Republicans have found this sort of addictive electoral tool in running against government that has taken the pressure off of them from having to think about what their positive governing message is. And that's really in a lot of ways I think that's what's made them a troubled party in recent years that has lost the popular vote in 5 out of the last 6 elections.
Do you think Ronald Reagan could win a Republican nomination for anything these days?
You hear that a lot these days, this idea that today's Republican Party is so strident and obsessive about ideological purity that even Ronald Reagan couldn't get elected. The reality, I think, is that Reagan was, deeply pragmatic about matters of his own self-interest. And so if he were running in today's Republican Party, he would probably figure out exactly where he needed to be in order to get elected. But I do think a big difference between Reagan and a lot of the people that we see running in today's Republican Party is that he would also be preoccupied at all times on how is he going to take this conservative message and sell it to a broader audience. And we really see him doing that again and again in the mid-1960s. He was involved in Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign, and he was involved in Goldwater's very bloody primary fight in California against Nelson Rockefeller. And after Goldwater won that primary, Reagan stood up in a room full of Goldwater supporters and said, let's go make love to Democrats. We don't want to win a convention. We want to win an election. And Reagan actually got booed for saying that. But that was always what he was thinking about, was how does this play to a broader group. And that's something that really a lot of today's Republicans are more challenged with, as we saw in the last presidential primary cycle, and we may see again in 2016.
When, and of course, along those same lines, too, during his presidency, Reagan famous for he and Tip O'Neill, or, they'd scream at each other all day long, but at the end of the day, they'd put everything away and have a beer and watch Monday Night Football or whatever it was. So you certainly don't see that nowadays.
You don't, and I think part of that, and this is again a sort of difference between Reagan and a lot of these sort of box-checking litmus test conservatives of today. One of the things that emerges in the story of Reagan in the 1960s is he's someone who cares passionately about one issue, which is the threat of international communism. And he believes in sort of doctrinaire conservative positions on everything else, but he doesn't really feel that strongly about them. So it's not that hard for him to compromise. And the same thing is true in the 1980s. He was able to make a deal with someone like Tip O'Neill because he didn't feel that every single issue was one that he had to go, crucify himself for. He understood that there were certain principles that on which he wouldn't compromise, and on everything else, reality requires you to make deals with the other side.
We're speaking with Jonathan Darman. His book, Landslide, Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan at the Dawn of a New America, which tells the story of 1,000 days in the mid-'60s when these two iconic presidents were transforming the nation's politics. What are each of these presidents' legacies? How will history treat them, say, 50, 75 years from now?
I think that history will see them both as incredibly consequential presidents who saw for a moment an opportunity in this country to affect real change and certainly change their parties and the country too. There is no, 50, 75, 100 years from now, people will look at what Lyndon Johnson did on civil rights in 1964 and 1965 and say, here is a president who took action that had been procrastinated on since the time of Lincoln and finally got it done to deliver, the full promises of the Constitution and the Declaration to all Americans. And that is a legacy that is just, staggering. And any generation is going to look back on that in admiration. Reagan, I think, people will see as someone who in the late 20th century really gave respectability to this movement, conservatism, which had been, a lot of people thought in the post-New Deal era, sort of a fringe that was destined for the dust heap of history. A lot of people up until the mid-1960s really did believe that, the complexities of modern life required an active and engaged federal government in people's lives. So Reagan, is someone that history will always view as a president or as a politician and then a president who was able to find a sort of workable political framework for that anti-government message, which has really shaped a lot of our history in the last 50 years.
Do you think there will be any gigantic personalities like LBJ and Reagan again, and do we even need outsized presidents?
Oh, I think we certainly could use outsized presidents. I mean, especially in this environment where there are so many different media and so many different distractions. If you had an outsized personality like a Johnson or a Reagan who could rise above it all, it would be, really interesting to see what someone could do with that power. I think particularly the Lyndon Johnson style of politician is maybe not one that we will have in our midst again. There was, a certain earthiness and real crassness even to Johnson's style of arm twisting that in a sort of 24-hour media surveillance landscape you really can't get away with, particularly not when you're the President of the United States and everything you do is inherently interesting in the media culture. But I do think that that a president in the Johnson or Reagan mold who really sets out in this another moment of great anxiety in this country and speaks to the country and says, I have a new vision to offer, is someone that could gain a lot of support in the country.
Okay. Jonathan Darman, his book, Landslide, Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan at the Dawn of a New America. Great stuff. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Great. I enjoyed it. Thanks.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Jonathan Allen, co-author of a book about Hillary Clinton.
On the subject of HRC, Jon Stewart raised an interesting question last night, I don't know whether you saw it, about the fact that why is it that she's out there all by herself? Let's listen up.
Hillary Clinton is seems to be in a tight race with Senator Nobody and Governor Bupkis. Not a single Democrat wants to pursue the nomination on the off chance Hillary may throw her hat in the ring. What's so scary about this woman's hat?
Why is she out there all alone?
I mean, at the danger and
or
risk
do you agree that she is?
She is out there all alone. I mean, there are other... Look, the degree of your seriousness as a candidate in the Democratic field is direct inverse proportion to your willingness to run against Hillary Clinton at this point. I hate to plug the book. I think one of the reasons.
No, you're here to plug the book. We want you to plug the book.
I think one of the.
I love the book.
I think one of the reasons is a motif, if you will, through the book that about Bill Clinton's revenge that he's taken out on Democrats that opposed her in 2008. I don't think anybody wants to be on the wrong side of Hillary should she become president. I think that has something to do with it. I also think that people can do pretty simple calculations. She's going to raise a lot of money. She's got a lot of support within the Democratic Party. Barack Obama's ability to beat her was, I think, a function of basically combining the white liberal base with the African-American base. Nobody else out there can do that with another minority group. She's great with Hispanics. The African-American community, short of Barack Obama on the ticket, I think would have been with her in 2008. So trying to put that coalition together, I think, is next to impossible.
But nobody else can really do that. But by the way, I do.
I'm sorry, progressive, I should say.
Yeah. What you said about the revenge is true. I have. Let me just say, I've been to a meeting with somebody else who was considering running. And I'm not going to go on name because I'm not in a position to do that. But I know that there were people invited to that meeting who said, just to have a discussion, right? Would not even show up to have a discussion because they were afraid of what might happen. What to them from the Clintons if they knew that they even had a conversation with somebody.
Yeah, they'd suddenly have a primary opponent who would be heavily funded by Clinton donors, and they wouldn't have their job anymore.
Or they wouldn't.
Or at least they're worried about it.
Or they wouldn't have a consulting contract. Or they wouldn't have a job. Whatever. Yeah. No. I mean, it's real. The fear of that machine. So now the word is that since.
And by the way, for Democrats, should she become president of the United States, maybe they'd like to instill some of that fear on the other side.
Right. Good point.
I mean, that's something that President Obama has lacked, I think, in his presidency, is the ability to really rattle the other side, to make them worry that he's going to win public opinion over or put them in a box. So that's, it's something to consider.
Now, reportedly, and maybe you can confirm or not, she's saying, well, there's nobody else around. What's the hurry? Why do I have to be in a hurry to announce it? I can take my own sweet time. We thought she was going to announce in April. Now, reportedly, they're saying maybe July. What's going on?
Well, I think what you have here is multiple camps within Clinton world, and all the camps in Clinton world talk to the press. So there are people who would like to see her move in April. There are people who would like to see her move in July, and as a result, one gets out there and says, we think it'll be April, and then the other one goes, oh, no, she's going to wait till July. I wrote a story in November for Bloomberg, and basically the gist of it was she's going to wait as long as she feels like she can. For obvious reasons. Why make herself a target? Why put herself in the position of having to answer questions about every sort of fleeting news of the day thing that pops up? Right now, she's able to pick and choose. The Bibi Netanyahu thing right now. I mean, it would be impossible were she a candidate for president to avoid commenting on that.
She hasn't spoken out about that, has she?
I don't believe so, and I would, I wouldn't imagine that she would. Why stick herself in the middle?
But she
of it?
did speak out about measles on the famous Twitter, which I thought was a great little Twitter. Said it all: science works, Earth is round, sky is blue, vaccines work, protect your kids, grandmothers know best. Boom.
140 characters.
Yeah.
I mean, if she could campaign from an ivory tower in 140 characters a pop, I'm sure she will. But I do think that there's one sort of pressing issue here, and there's, the people that wanted her to announce last year wanted her to announce last year so that consultants could have jobs. Yeah. I mean, there was that. I don't actually think that was really coming from, at that point, really so much coming from inside her camp as much as within the Democratic Party, the David Plouffes of the world, saying, look, hire my buddies that just lost Senate races and whatever. Now, though, she's hiring enough people that you're going to have to pay them somewhere. And if they go onto a super PAC payroll now, that'll look bad later if they go into a campaign payroll. So I think that will end up being a forcing mechanism. The larger the organization grows, the less she can rely on people to not draw paychecks for months and months at a time.
Which means maybe before July.
I think maybe before July.
Right. Okay. And in fact, we saw this week that two top people from the White House, John Podesta and Jennifer Palmieri, are leaving the White House reportedly to become part of the Hillary Clinton campaign. Jonathan Allen in studio with us, co-author of the book HRC. Very, very well written, well researched, and tells you the whole story of the Clinton machine, led by now Hillary Clinton, although Bill's not.
She's waxing, he's waning, but like where exactly they are, I'm not sure.
And the new book out now in paperback. Jonathan Allen, let's say hello to Lynn, calling from Chicago and the great WCPT. Hi, Lynn.
Hi, everybody. Listen, before we crown Hillary, you need to know that outside the Beltway, there are hundreds of thousands of people at the grassroots level that are attempting to get Elizabeth Warren to run. And point being, there's going to be a rally at the Water Tower, not Water Tower Place Shopping Center, but the Water Tower Park in Chicago Saturday, 11:30 to 12:30 on the 14th. We love Elizabeth Warren.
All right. Valentine's Day, love Elizabeth Warren at the Water Tower right there on Michigan Avenue. Now, I hope Elizabeth Warren runs, Jonathan, just because I'd like to see, a challenge in the primary and some interesting debates. But Elizabeth Warren says no.
I'd like to see Abraham Lincoln run, but he's not running.
Right. Yeah.
And I say that because Abraham Lincoln was a pretty good president.
Right.
Look, she says she's not running. She says she's really not running. She's not running this time. She's going to serve out her term in the Senate. Of course, you can change your mind. What would make her change her mind is if she thought she could win.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she's smart enough as a political analyst to look at it and say, I don't think I can win this. Now, maybe that'll change. Maybe Hillary's numbers come down. Maybe Elizabeth Warren's numbers go up. But I think at the moment, she looks at it, it's not a possibility. And she's got a pretty good gig influencing policy and politics from the Senate right now. She became like kind of the Ted Kennedy of the Senate without having to be in the Senate for 30-odd years.
Good point, yeah. All right. So it looks like I know we're just out of time. It looks like right now it's going to be the Hillary show, period. Huh?
On the Democratic side, and then there will be a hell of a fight for the presidency.
All right. If you didn't read the hardcover, get the paperback, HRC. Thank you, Jonathan.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Joseph Califano, Jonathan Darman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.